The Miserere of Allegri, sacred to the heart of the Vatican, transcribed by the ear and released to the world of the young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The music is a selection of our guest, journalist and author Peter Hitchens, whose book, The Rage Against God, is both a cri de coeur and something of a public extension of a continuing discussion with his brother, the well-known apostle of atheism, Christopher Hitchens. Peter, welcome to ABC Radio.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Peter, I recently replayed a discussion between you and your brother in which he generously concedes that though you differ on questions such as the existence of God, he nevertheless recognises that European Christendom was destroyed by the wars of the 20th century, and the jury is out on whether Western civilization can long endure its passing.
Well, quite. I think that was a conversation which we had in Washington a few months ago. And what he was simply doing was accepting half of my thesis, which is that the real reason for the destruction of Christianity in most of modern Europe was the catastrophe of the First World War, in which the Church wrongly managed to associate itself with what turned out to be rather a bad cause. And the results of that have been enormous. I have to say, in having this discussion, my brother has said a number of things over the past couple of years since he initially published a book whose title was How Religion Poisons Everything, which suggests that he doesn't really believe it or no longer believes that. And I've been quite interested in the way that people have been unwilling to notice these shifts. My main purpose in my discussions with him that I have had is not to persuade him to believe in God. That's something which I think is very difficult for him to do now. He's bricked himself up in his atheist tower. He has only arrow slits out of which to hurl fiery darts at his opponents. Can't really climb out of those. But to persuade him at least that those who do believe in God and who do think that religion has a purpose in our lives are not entirely stupid, and that religion doesn't poison everything. I think we're a little way down that path. It's quite pleasing under the circumstances.
Well, indeed, the tacit acknowledgement here is also part of, I think, the core argument of your book, The Rage Against God, that religion, and Christianity in particular, is a civilizational issue. It's not just about your personal private belief system.
Very much not a private thing, though I thought initially when I returned to the faith, 20-odd years ago, that it was a private matter. I rapidly discovered through my education, and particularly in the old Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact lands, which have now disappeared, that this wasn't so, because I was able to live inside and see in detail and at close quarters a society which had specifically set its face against religious belief, and most particularly against Christian belief, and was still a civilization of sorts, but one which lacked several very important things, and which also contained some rather nasty things, which I think we could well do without.
Well, let's talk about the journey. You've referred yourself to part of the journey that you took, that you came back to Christianity some years ago. Let's talk about that era in which both of us grew up, an era post-World War II, baby boomers, released into a world which their parents had found quite difficult, had to endure much, and inherited a beneficence which one could interpret you as saying that we largely trashed.
Yes, I think it's the most amazing episode of ingratitude, and I think of myself as being a terrible ingrate during much of that period. Our parents treated us tremendously kindly because they themselves had experienced so much harshness and so much deprivation. I think parents are always trying to improve on how their own parents did, and our parents had been in a world almost completely unrecognizable to us, and they thought, right, well, our children are not going to endure this. And we rewarded them by turning on them and saying, oh, you're outdated and foolish, and you have nothing to say to us, and we don't care for your authority. We are the cleverest generation that ever lived. The world that they had themselves rescued from disaster was one we took entirely for granted. And then on top of that, it always seems to me, looking back on the very end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, as if someone had put something in the water. We fell victim to a sort of collective madness, which receded a little bit afterwards, but the damage that it did has never, ever been undone. And I do describe it as a cultural revolution, obviously elderly professors were not thrown from the roofs of buildings, and people weren't beaten up and beaten to death by crowds of Red Guards. But metaphorically, we did much the same. We did trash our culture in an extraordinarily self-indulgent, self-important way.
What were the
still
critical?
Makes my flesh creep to think about it.
What were the critical elements of that collective madness, as you say? What were the essential elements that were trashed?
Well, I'm afraid it can be summed up as sex and drugs and rock and roll. I think we wanted to have a good time, and we thought we were entitled to have a good time, and anybody who got in our way or who suggested to us that this might do any damage or that we were ignoring any important rules was considered to be not merely an obstacle, but a stupid, obstructive, reactionary obstacle who could be laughed at and safely ignored. I remember feeling that way.
You do take the trouble, however, to point out that there were probably some good reasons for feeling that way.
Well, I don't know whether they were good reasons. There were reasons why you might, and I'd spent a long time trying to work out why it was that I'd gone so far down this extremely unpleasant path myself. And it was necessary to me to understand why I turned into what I now regard as a monster.
Well, you spend a couple of chapters in your book.
And I think I couldn't readily sum it up here. But I think one of the things was that I had been brought up, as many people of my generation, and I was the son of a naval officer who, not just a wartime naval officer, but a career naval officer who'd grown up in naval bases and gone to school in the sorts of places where service children went. I'd been brought up, really, for a world that no longer existed. And the funny thing about the 1950s in England was that a very, very successful attempt initially was made to restore, in some ways, the 1930s. Most of the people who'd gone through the war thought, let's try and go back to the way we were before. And superficially, they achieved it. But morally, they hadn't really. Deep down, society was still in turmoil because of the huge damage that had been done in 1914 to 1918 that still had gone so deep inside that the trunk of the tree appeared to be solid, but really it was just a bark surrounding an empty core. And
yes, the spirit had been broken.
Oh, completely, I think. But you could at home, and you could in your imagination, and you could at school up to a certain age continue to believe the old world was there. But as soon as you moved out beyond that into the new Britain that was being created around you, the rather unpleasant new Britain as I now see it, you realized that the world for which you had been prepared had vanished.
You saw it culturally, of course, in the lead up to that period with the emergence of kitchen sink drama and those sorts of things, which people said, look, this old world isn't as you would have it to be. Take the scales from your eyes. And there was a strong element of truth in that.
Well, they didn't merely say that. They said that what we had been brought up to believe were manners and self-restraint were curious, outdated tribal customs and what they called repression. I think this word repression is very important here, and the cod Freudianism, which has taken over a lot of our discourse, has played a great role. People were taught to believe that stopping yourself from doing practically anything was bad for you. And the whole of our society had been based upon self-discipline and self-restraint. And once the idea got out that instead of doing this, it was far better to let yourself do what you wanted to do and basically follow that the one commandment of atheism, do what thou wilt, then that was over. And of course, one of the things about following that commandment is that quite often the immediate consequences for you are pleasurable. This great confusion which has arisen in the world that followed between pleasure and happiness. And an enormous amount of pleasure became available in that time. Could be bought quite cheap, could be obtained quite easily, and substituted in many people's lives for the happiness which they thought they were seeking.
You point out that as you were growing up and going through this period when, as you say, the world in which you brought up really no longer existed, you give a couple of telling examples of institutions crumbling both externally and internally. The empire was fading at that pivotal moment. And many of us as young people, I was probably 12 or 13 myself, watched in 1965 the funeral of Winston Churchill. And you take that as a signal moment as well.
Well, I do. That I have written about at length in another book called The Abolition of Britain, which I actually published now more than 10 years ago, in which I'd make a comparison between the funerals of Winston Churchill and of Princess Diana and of the wholly different countries which existed at the time they took place. But it was a moment, undoubtedly, of recognition that something was over forever. It was the funeral of the British Empire. It was the funeral of Britain as a serious country. It was, in many ways, the funeral of the old middle-class domination of society and the funeral of social conservatism. And I think a lot of people sat down that day in front of their television set with a pot of tea and a plate of sandwiches to watch this thing, and thinking it would be a comforting and in some way engaging spectacle, because after all no one was really distressed that this very old man had died. And then at the end of it, as the steam train bore the coffin off into the countryside and it was all over, realised that something had gone that was irreplaceable, that the groves had been cut down, that a belief which had previously managed to sustain itself despite a long period of decline could no longer be sustained by any serious person, and the spirit had gone.
And the hypocrisy of the moment, you point out, was sustained by examples of the political culture. That is the scandal of Suez, or really the humiliation of the Suez crisis, and then the scandal of the Profumo affair.
Yes, and after these, you couldn't really believe anymore the people who were in charge of the country knew what they were doing, or that they were as they appeared to be. And even I, as a small boy, was vaguely conscious at the time of Suez that something had gone wrong when my father, a naval officer, for heaven's sake, a man who wore gold braid on his sleeves, had to bicycle across the top of Dartmoor on an old bone shaker because there was no petrol. And you knew that something was wrong. What I didn't realise was that when a few years later he was beached and the Navy said they didn't want him anymore, these two things were intimately connected. I worked that out later. And then along came Profumo. And I didn't know what a call girl was, or an osteopath. But I knew that something pretty rakish was going on, and that these people who appeared before us with their plummy voices and their well-tied guards' ties and their polished shoes were not as they seemed. And the policeman, the vicar, the teacher, everybody who had authority over us was weakened by these things. And you knew it. You knew if you pushed that they wouldn't fight. And I found that because I had the kind of adolescent spirit which puts up a fight, and I found that when I fought, they gave in. And actually, it's very dispiriting when people whom you've regarded as the limits of your life and the begetters of authority give in. You think, well, what's left? Where's the bottom? How far can I actually go? You're completely adrift.
For many people, the essence of the whole charade was the religious structure which seemed ostensibly to support this through over 1,000 years.
Well, it had been, in some ways, too intimately connected. You go into any of the ancient English cathedrals, and in at least one of the aisles, and probably more, you'll find battle flags hanging. And the connection between the two, between empire and victory, and the navy and the army and the church, is indissoluble, really, in the mind of anybody who's paying attention. And so when the one fails, the other begins to fail as well. And an awful lot of the religion which I was taught, which by the standards of religious education of today was actually quite rigorous. I know far more of the Bible than I would have thought anybody growing up 20 or 30 years later would have done, and a lot more besides. But it was very bound up with patriotism. And the real religion of post-war Britain was we won the war. And when it became apparent that we hadn't actually won the war, we just failed to lose it, and that we were in many ways worse off as a result of what we'd done than we would have been if we'd stayed out of it, I think a lot of people began to wonder whether all the other beliefs that were attached and all the other ceremonies and rites which went alongside we won the war were as valid as we thought they were. I certainly did.
So we junked that belief in that historic edifice and grasped for something new. Science presents itself. A scientific socialism presents itself. And you're one of those.
Well, it did to me.
Here we go.
It did to me. I came across it at that stage, and it seemed to be a good, satisfactory substitute. Internationalism instead of patriotism, scientific socialism instead of religion, utopianism instead of a belief in heaven, and it fitted neatly fairly neatly into the gap that had been left behind. It took actually a surprisingly short time to realise that this was also a fake, but during that time, one could do a lot of damage. I certainly did.
John Cleary with you. We're talking with Peter Hitchens, author of The Rage Against God. Peter, let's pause, have a piece of music, and another of your selections from Corelli's Christmas Concerto, the sixth movement. Why?
I'm not sure why. This is the trouble with me in music. I know that it moves me. I don't know why. I don't understand what happens. But this, you see, as you listen to it, you see Christmas morning, and that's a beautiful light which you get in Northern Europe, particularly during December, during Advent and towards Christmas, which always seems to me to suggest that ordinary time is falling into step with eternity. And this particular piece of music, done as Corelli wrote for the night of Christmas, just seems to distill that light into sound. How that happens and whether that's just me, I wouldn't like to say. The language of music is a very puzzling thing. I think somebody once did say it was the language in which God speaks to man. But that's what it does for me. I hope it does something similar for other people.
From Corelli's Christmas Concerto, a selection of our guest, Peter Hitchens, author of The Rage Against God, something of a riposte to his brother Christopher Hitchens, apostle of atheism. Peter Hitchens, that piece of music, you described it as something of an encounter with God. For you, the return of a religious sensibility and the need to fill a gap in your own life was more of an aesthetic experience initially than one that could be approached rationally.
And why not? After all, we often know things aesthetically long before we know them rationally. Reason sometimes has a great effort to catch up with feelings, and that's one of the purposes of music, architecture, and poetry. How many of us, when we read a piece of poetry and it suddenly causes a catch in the throat or brings tears to the eyes, knows why this has happened on this particular occasion?
For you, it was
we apprehend things through these things that we wouldn't apprehend if they were set out in prose, even if they could be. And the fact is, a lot of the essentials of religion can't really be set out in prose. And I thought to myself,
indeed,
well,
but you do.
I get endlessly mocked by atheists for saying that my behaviour is altered by fear. And they say, oh, well, Hitchens says he'd behave much worse if he wasn't afraid of the big sky daddy. And I say, well, that's exactly the case. And I would turn to any of them and say, have you never, ever been motivated by fear in your lives? And, of course, none of them could truthfully say that they hadn't. But it's not something that people like to admit because fear is a shameful emotion. But I feel it, and I think I've felt it on a number of occasions, and it's been very useful to me. That's what it's about. I wouldn't raise it much above that level. It's about realizing that that there's a wonderful Father Brown story by G.K. Chesterton in which one of the characters asked Father Brown, "Do you believe in doom?" He said, "No, I do believe in doomsday. And I do believe that we look at the world from the wrong side of the tapestry. We misunderstand the consequences of our actions, and we don't realize that what we do here matters somewhere else." And it's that realization which actually makes you go cold when you first experience it.
When you speak of it, you are also speaking in the context, and you're writing rather, in the context of an appreciation that we had lost something of our culture at depth. You also mentioned the messiness of life that you'd lost hold of too, and you point to sort of even things like sort of decimal currency rather than the old pounds, shillings and pence as an indicator that there was a culture at depth that we were losing by this radical, harsh, almost cubist view of the world.
Well, yes, it's true, and the business about decimal currency and geometric measures and all the rest of it, which a lot of people dismiss as trivial, is actually quite significant in the destruction of the familiar, and not just the familiar, but things which have developed and been polished in use by human beings and have come up through centuries of tradition and handed on, and also involves some self-discipline to learn. I must have sat, I can't remember doing it, I must have sat in classrooms chanting 16 ounces make a pound, 14 pounds make a stone, 8 stone make a hundredweight, 20 hundredweight make a ton, until I had it by heart. I can do 22 yards make a chain, and 10 chains make a furlong, and 8 chains make a mile.
I do remember that.
Make a mile. And you had to make the effort, like the times tables. Once you had it, you had it. Then someone came along and said, well, all you need to do is count your toes, like some ignorant peasant, and that'll do, and get rid of all these things. But it's a less complicated, a less rewarding, and in some ways a less interesting world that replaces it. I remember when they taught me the metric system, thinking, oh, that'll be interesting, learning another system, and then finding it incredibly dull. It's just 10 by 10 by 10 by 10 by 10. Well, how dull is that, and how inflexible? And how many things can't you actually divide by 10? What measure in the metric system can be divided by 3? Not a single one.
Which appropriately leads to a chapter that you fascinatingly entitle Homo Sovieticus, a way of thinking about the world.
Yeah. Well, they did try. They really did think they were going to create a new man. And it's quite extraordinary that in a way they did. I remember my first fortnight in Moscow when I went to live there in June 1990, going to see a film in a cinema called the Cosmos. Everything they really rated was called the Cosmos, because it was to do with space, the one thing where they'd actually achieved something. And everybody in the cinema was crying. And the reason was that they were showing a film which, disgracefully, to my knowledge, has never been shown in any Western cinema or in any Western television station, called Tak Žít nельзя, which means approximately we can't go on living like this. And it had been authorized very reluctantly by the Politburo for public display, because it was the first time anybody had actually admitted what a squalid dump the Soviet Union was. There were pictures of the very end of the Soviet Union in Alaska with a horrible brown pipe dribbling muck into the sea. There's pollution, desecrated churches smeared with filth, barbaric prisoners shuffling about in horrible prisons, and one scene which sticks in my mind of a vodka queue, all the people turning up to collect their vodka ration, of reasonably respectably dressed people wearing hats and ties and belted raincoats, and suddenly word comes out that there's going to be no vodka delivery that week, and it dissolves into a sort of riot of desperation. And they all knew, all the people watching this knew this is what their country was like, and they also knew that for every year of their lives since they first went to school, they hadn't been allowed to say so anywhere in public. And suddenly it was being acknowledged. And they were all crying. And they had created a new man. And he was very, very, very much inferior to the old one, to the Christian man which had preceded him. There's an awful lot of... Revolutions always defame the past. And it's difficult. I can say that pre-revolutionary Russia had many, many faults. No one can deny that. But by comparison with the monstrous hell that 70 years of communism created, it was paradise. This man, the man who made this film, Stanislav Gavrilyukin, who was a great friend of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, made a second film, Россия, которой потерялась, The Russia We Have Lost, which went even deeper into the archives and showed, again, how much beauty and civilization had been destroyed by the revolutionary spite. And people should realize just how dogged and deliberate and violent and spiteful the Bolshevik Revolution was, and yet people still defend it as if it was a progressive act. And I'm afraid I have to number my brother among these, who has on occasion praised Lenin. Now, Lenin was a dreadful, violent, filthy-tempered killer, and one of the worst people of the 20th century, and did things which remain almost unspeakably foul. And we do have to understand the deliberate way in which these people tore out by the roots much of European and Christian civilization in the mistaken belief that they could replace it with something better.
Peter Hitchens is our guest. Peter, let's have another piece of music, and this appropriately from Handel, The Messiah, I Know That My Redeemer Liveth. I know that my Redeemer liveth. From The Messiah of Handel. Peter Hitchens, our guest, author of The Rage Against God. Peter, what in this gathering assemblage of thoughts leads you to actually say, I actually want now to take Christianity seriously? I mean, one didn't have to do that. One could have, and many have great reservations about the Soviet Union, what went on there, about the progress of a secular civilization that seems to be problematic, without necessarily saying, actually, I need to take religion seriously again, and I actually need to take Christianity in particular seriously again.
Well, to some extent, this is a cliche. Anybody who's grown up would say they had the same experiences. I did grow up. I got married. I became a parent. And that changes people, I think, enormously. It opens up parts of the mind and the conscience which were previously closed and creates a requirement for something. It doesn't necessarily create a requirement for a religious belief, but it creates a requirement which a religious belief satisfies. I think that the default position of any thinking person looking at the universe has to be agnosticism, because you can't know whether there is or is not a God. Not for certain. It's not within the bounds of scientific inquiry or reason to establish that. To move beyond that, there has to be a desire. And I found myself desiring very strongly that the universe should be ordered and should have a purpose, and that purpose should be discoverable, and that I would, in the course of discovering it, fit better into it than I otherwise would, because otherwise there seemed to be absolutely no reason for doing any of the things that I was doing. Why bother telling the truth? Why bother raising children with any care? Why bother doing anything better than the most basic possible way in which it was done?
That purpose is useful. That is, it's functional.
Yes, but how can anybody want that? I can see why somebody can say, well, I don't know if there's a purpose. That seems to me to be quite a reasonable position. Though one that I don't take. What I can't really grasp is why someone should look at the universe and say, I don't want this to have a purpose or a meaning or a reason, and I don't want to have any purpose within it, which is actually the atheist position. And it's one which seems to me to need much more interrogation. And those who espouse it are very seldom asked this. I cite in my book a very interesting American philosopher called Thomas Nagel, who is an atheist, but who, unlike most of the modern atheists, is not a railing, abusive one. He doesn't spend his time saying how stupid Christians are, though he disagrees with Christianity and has a lot of criticisms of it. What he says, however, is how interesting it is that so many people want there not to be a God. And he asked why. And I think it's a reasonable question. It's where I would like to divert this whole argument of atheists versus Christians. I say neither of us can prove that we're right. What we can do is ask why it is that we believe what we believe. If it is a choice, which I believe it is, why would you choose one or not the other? And above all, if you want to be an atheist, explain to me what it is about a purposeless, futile universe that you find so attractive.
Well, you then get into perhaps rehearsing some of the standard arguments that atheists use, and you do rehearse those in your book. The arguments about religion being responsible for wars, even if not all wars, certainly as many wars as atheism is. So religion has ultimately no real benefit to society, and that seems to be one of the central arguments that Christopher puts forward, that there are no benefits to be had from religion.
I don't think you can really seriously argue that. I mean, apart from anything else, most of the wars which are attributed to religion are not really religious in nature. As I point out, the conflict in Northern Ireland was not over one group of people saying we think that Christ is truly present in the Eucharist and another saying they weren't. They were categorized as Protestant versus Catholic. But it wasn't about justification by faith alone. It was a tribal war in which the religious affiliation of one group was different from the religious affiliation of the other, and that accounts for most of the wars which are supposedly called religious. That's fatuous. The other thing is any religious person will tell you that people fail to follow the tenets of religion properly. Is it the religion that's made them behave in this belligerent fashion, or is it their humanity? And I would say it was their humanity, and where humanity lacks a proper understanding of what God is and what he requires of us, then humanity behaves in cruel ways. I was very struck. There's a very fine Anglican minister of my acquaintance who once gave rather a good sermon, in which he concluded that the important thing that we had to recognize is that love is the opposite of power. And I think that is an enormously important statement about the relations of human beings one to another. I've seen a lot of power exercised in my time as a Fleet Street journalist, an awful lot of power. And it's a very poor substitute for love, and it often operates in a different direction. And the more love there is, the less power there needs to be. I think that's fundamentally the religious position in whatever circumstances you get yourself into. And it would argue almost always against war.
Well, that takes us directly into the area of morality, and many people would argue that one does not need to have a religious faith to construct a perfectly adequate moral system, a system of moral values.
I think that's quite true. You can construct an adequate moral system. I would defy anybody to say, for instance, that Japan wasn't an extraordinarily civilized society whose people have a strong moral sense, and it's not Christian. But I think it's inferior to what can be obtained through the acceptance of the Christian faith as a general thing.
So here comes an exercise of judgment. That is, I judge that these canons are better than that set of canons.
Well, yes, I do, and I think partly because of the cost that one pays in Japan for the order and civilization is a tremendous level of conformism, for instance, which I would, if I lived there, ultimately I think find rather oppressive. Much as I love Japan, I think it's in many cases a society to be emulated, and there are other prices that one pays as well. It's also capable of considerable violence. Externally, but also internally, and cruelty at times of strain. Now, one of the things about a moral system which is truly absolute is that at times of strain, it still continues to stop people from doing wicked things. And again, another of my strong examples is that of Bishop George Bell, Bishop of Chichester, the first English cathedral with which I had any connection. I've since discovered quite a lot about Bishop Bell. He was one of the very few people in Britain during the Second World War, he was prepared to say, which I believe to be true, that the deliberate bombing of the homes of German civilians in the Second World War was wrong. And you will still find an awful lot of people who profess to be morally good saying this is justified. People are constantly writing books saying this was a moral combat in which the bombing of German cities was okay. It wasn't. Just as you'll find people they'll be vegetarians. They'll be tremendously gentle in their private life. But they will be prepared to license the killing of an unborn baby in the womb for the convenience of the mother. And they will count themselves to be morally sound. I'm afraid, I think, that the justification of the mass murder of German civilians or the justification of the killing of babies in the womb is impossible. They are both ultimately, absolutely, impossibly wrong. And you can't defend them. And it's very inconvenient to a lot of people to admit this. And that's why these are both subjects on which people who count themselves in many ways as highly moral find themselves, in my view, on the wrong side of morality. Because in the end, when the morality comes under strain, when their own personal convenience or their own self-estimation or indeed their patriotism comes up against an act which is plainly wrong, patriotism or their own personal convenience triumph. Absolute morality insists on itself even when it doesn't suit you. And that's the point about it. And I don't think there is any atheist system of morality which comes up with precepts which are still enforced when they don't suit you. It's always full of excuses and get-outs.
It takes us to why you decide that Christianity, for you, is a moral system that you opt for. You give several examples straight out of the sayings of Jesus. A greater love hath no man that he lay down his life for his friend. You put this as an extraordinary imposition on people. Yet, of course, even something as morally deep and strong as that can be abused. And you point out it's abused through warfare, because no line of Jesus has been more abused through the shrines of remembrance that pepper English countryside and Australian country towns.
Well, it's what's Siegfried Sassoon called the sepulchres of crime. Yes, but it was abused for propaganda purposes. It was abused for state purposes. But from what I know of soldiers, I would reckon that it was probably true, that most of those people were laying down their lives for their friends. Not pro patria mori, but for their friends. That's what people do in war. They stick to the people who they're with.
Yes, you also.
So there is a truth in it. The other thing is that it's something I'm pretty certain I couldn't do. By good or bad fortune, you can decide which. I've wandered unintentionally into the fringes of a couple of rather unpleasant war zones, and I know what my response is when the bullets start to fly. And I wonder, what I would do, with the person in the blazing car whom I could rescue, or the child drowning in the canal whom I could dive in to save, possibly at the risk of my own life. Would I be capable of doing it? I don't know. It's a very harsh measure. I hope I would, but I fear I wouldn't. But I also know that ultimately that I ought to.
It takes us to another couple of the injunctions of Christ too, that you point as particularly strong indicators of a social morality. That is, giving away your cloak and go the second mile. Those things which take you beyond simply the golden rule. That there are things here which take you much further than the golden rule.
Much further. And inconveniently and disturbingly further.
And they ultimately have an important role in shaping the way a community develops.
Yes, and even if we fail at them, the knowledge of our failure and the knowledge that we ought to have done them influences ultimately our future behaviour and the behaviour of the whole society.
Let's have another piece of music. Jesus Christ, the Apple Tree, by Elizabeth Poston. Why have you chosen this?
It's partly because it is so extraordinarily beautiful. It's the verse on which it's based is actually from New England, though probably originally from Old England. Contains the lines, "For happiness I long have sought, and pleasure dearly have I bought. I missed for all, but now I see 'tis found in Christ, the apple tree." It's partly because there's a lot of truth in that. It's also partly because while Elizabeth Poston was creating this setting of this poem in Cambridge in the 1960s, I was engaging in my puerile revolt against God and didn't know either these words or this music at the time, and wish I had.
Jesus Christ, the Apple Tree. A selection of our guest, Peter Hitchens, the author of The Rage Against God. Peter Hitchens, let's come now to the implications of your belief for each and all of us, and it takes us back to where we began. Christianity as a civilizing influence, or religion, and in particular Christianity as a civilizing agent. What sort of society and what sort of values then are critical? If we move away from the statist model, how far along the paradigm to the individualist model does Christianity take us? Where along this continuum does the good society fit and shape itself?
I don't know. I think it varies. It's been said that the Holy Ghost has moved some people to be conservatives and some people to be socialists.
I think Gilbert and Sullivan also said it. What is it? Every man or woman alive is born a little liberal or a little conservative. That was how they were born. I don't think Gilbert and Sullivan mentioned the Holy Ghost very often. But if he came into any of their operettas, I haven't noticed it. But the point is that I think one shouldn't try to make politics a reflection of religion, or imagine that because somebody disagrees with you about the details of politics that he's a worse Christian than you are, or any such thing. I think that you have to accept that people will disagree about these things, and must, because at different times and in different places some things are wrong and some things are right, and some things which are may be technically right turn out to be downright barbaric in application. So no, I don't think that one can say that there's a Christian political view beyond this, that a society which is more based upon the individual conscience and in which people restrain themselves is more likely to be free, and in freedom is more likely to produce
fully developed human beings who understand the limits of what they can do and both seek to reach those limits in good and preserve themselves within the limits to prevent themselves from doing evil is about the best we can hope for. But ultimately it's not the purpose, is it? The purpose is elsewhere. The interesting thing is that if you follow the manual, then the machine works better, which would seem to me to make perfect sense and would suggest that it's the right manual. But the real purpose is elsewhere. The real purpose is that what we do here matters somewhere else.
The reason I ask it is because we are going through an era where, albeit there's vociferous atheism, part of the reason for that vociferous atheism is what they see as a response to a sort of aggressive, personalised civil religion that seems to be reasserting itself. And
if only it were. I think that what they actually see is an opportunity to remove Christianity from the constitutions and legal systems and education systems of their country.
Yeah, but take the Tea Party movement in the United States and the way people like Glenn Beck are appropriating some form of religious sanction to their view of the way the world should work.
Well, they haven't helped them out, or rather not. I think that way lies the same fate for American Christianity which befell British Christianity after the Second World War. Associate yourself too closely with temporal things, and you'll find that when those temporal things fail, you fail too. You marry the spirit of the age, and you'll pretty quickly find yourself widowed. So I don't sympathise.
The gloomy dean.
Well, indeed, and true as many gloomy things are.
You also illustrate this by giving the example of the Iraq War, which unlike your brother who supports, you have great reservations about.
Well, it's utopianism, and the reason why he supports it is utopianism. He believes that in some way bombs and bullets and high explosive and huge piles of dollars can create new societies in the Middle East. I think this is a fantasy. I think it's a dangerous fantasy, and I think that the end result of it is that you find yourself standing in front of a great lake of blood and a pyramid of skulls saying, well, this was all justified.
And it also leads you to lies and corruption, as you point out in the case.
Well, yes, I'm afraid it does. But the exercise of power almost invariably will. And again, it's the worship of power as opposed to the worship of love, and that's what utopianism almost invariably is. And that's why, as I say in the book, utopia can only ever be approached across a sea of blood. I think I add that you never actually get there. You are canoeing away across this Red Sea, but in the end, land is always receding before you. Utopia never arrives, and one of the interesting things about utopia is that it's always very loosely defined. Quite what it was that the invaders of Iraq intended to grow there once they'd uprooted Saddam Hussein was never clear, but I don't think it can conceivably be what they've got.
Does this mean that the quest for the good society is ultimately a vain one, that we shouldn't strive to better those who are around us through the institutions of government?
No, I don't think it means that at all, but I think it means that often you'll achieve this by being less ambitious than being more ambitious, and by starting with yourself. And William Blake said that good should be done in minute particulars, and that the general good was the resort of the scoundrel. Begin with yourself, begin with your own conscience and your own behaviour. And remember always, in so much as you have done this unto the least of one of these, you have done it unto me, and society will improve, and so will you. But start with enormous reformist utopian projects, and the chances are that in the end you'll get so annoyed with the stupid, unteachable morons who don't agree with you that you'll be cramming them into concentration camps before you've finished your second term. It just is the wrong approach. The general good is very hard to achieve. And all reform should start with the individual human being. And I think that works better. That doesn't mean that individual human beings in a free society can't, within reason, try to ameliorate conditions. Ameliorating conditions, that's something everybody can aspire to do. But when they try to create new people and change people rather than conditions, that's when you need to become suspicious of them. The only way you change people is one by one in their own hearts.
Peter Hitchens, great to talk with you. We've run out of time, but we are going to finish with perhaps a little nostalgia, a touch of the heart, an aspiration to that which we hoped could be, but ultimately never could. You've selected the Soviet national anthem, and now, of course, restored as the Russian one. Just
no
give us an
words.
indication of what's stirred by this tune.
Oh, it's a fantastic piece of music. There's no question of it, and it stirs in the heart all kinds of things which are fundamentally good, but in a very, very bad cause. The original words included praise of Stalin as well as Lenin. They cut that out, but it begins with the words "unbreakable union of sovereign republics," and we always used to sing it satirically by going on. Unbreakable union of sovereign republics, how shall we ever get out of this place? But it is a tremendous tune, and it lifts the heart. And if you don't know what the words are, then it may well push you in the right direction. But always remember that it was in fact the anthem of an evil empire. It brings back, in my mind, both the beauties and pleasures and the enormous sadness of the great city of Moscow, in which I spent 2.5 absolutely riveting, fascinating and life-changing years.
A salutary warning against utopian dreams. Peter Hitchens, thanks so much for joining us.